All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the North American Conference on British Studies. This event is part of our virtual book series where we highlight new publications by NACBS members. And today we are joined by Karl Ittmann, and he will be in conversation with William Story about his latest work. So I am just going to briefly introduce our guests, and then I will turn it over to Karl for a short sort of some comments from him. William will then comment and ask a few questions, and then after that, we will open it up for Q&A from the audience. So since we will have time for questions, feel free to keep those in mind. If at any point you'd like to drop your questions into the chat, you can go ahead and do so. And then when we turn to the Q&A session, we can pull from there as well. Or you can hold on to them and we'll raise our Zoom hands either way. So Karl Ittmann is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Houston. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1987 and served as Professor of History at the University of Houston from 1989 to 2025. His publications include Work, Gender, and Family in Victorian England, published by New York University Press in 1995. A Problem of Great Importance, Population, Race, and Power in the British Empire, 1918 to 1973, for University of California Press in 2013. And then the work we're going to be hearing about today, Fueling Empire, the British Imperial Oil Complex, 1886 to 1945, from OUP this year. He's also co-edited The Demographics of Empire, The Colonial Order and the Creation of Knowledge in 2010 with Greg Maddox and Dennis Cordell. And so he'll be joined in conversation by William Story, who is Professor of History and Sanderson Chair in Arts and Sciences at Millsaps College. His most recent book, The Colonialist, The Vision of Cecil Rhodes, was published by Oxford University Press in 2025. And previously, he has written books about guns in Southern Africa and sugarcane farming in Mauritius, and currently serves as one of the co-editors of the 6-volume Bloomsbury Cultural History of Technology. So I hope that you will join me in welcoming our guests today, and then I will turn it over to Karl to get started.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and thanks, William, for agreeing to do comment. I'll just keep it very brief, talk a little bit about how I fell into this project. And as I say in my sort of acknowledgments, I grew up on the Gulf Coast in the middle of the oil industry and have lived most of my life on the Gulf Coast. And so the oil industry is sort of omnipresent. And when I found myself back here, which I never thought would happen in the late 80s, I was very interested in the dynamics of the oil industry. And I also fell into a department that had multiple scholars of energy and environment. And that led me to a much greater interest in sort of energy history and its relationship to larger trends. And so when I finished my second book, I decided to try to launch this project, and I was encouraged by my colleagues like Joe Pratt and Marty Melozzi. And it occurred to me as I started, it was a viable project because no one had really written about what I was interested in, which is the larger context of the British oil industry, particularly the imperial context. And so as I got into it, I realized that it was a much bigger project than I had originally anticipated. It's also the case that as I started writing, the amount of literature written about the oil industry exploded, and much of it very, very good. And it forced me to sort of rethink how I was going to approach this project, a very different project than I would have done 10 years ago. And so it led to this, and I was lucky that Oxford was interested and was able to get this out before I retired. Other than that, I'm going to leave it there and let William talk and let you all have questions so that I don't take up too much time talking about what I used to do.
Okay, well, thank you, Karl, and thank you also to Amanda and the NACBS for setting up our Zoom session today. It's good to be with all of you out there. The historians in the audience are already going to be familiar with some of the global histories of the oil industry that have been written for general audiences, and key among them is probably The Prize by Daniel Yergin, which came out in 1991. I went over to my bookshelf and checked, and that one weighed in at 876 pages, and it came with an 8-hour TV documentary series. Colleagues might also be familiar with an excellent and mercifully more concise book published in 2012 by Brian Black called Crude Reality, which I've used successfully with undergraduates. These general works about the oil industry tend to emphasize the U.S. origins of the industry and then weave in the stories of other countries like the British Empire. And key among them in that story about the British Empire has been an emphasis on the strategic needs and shifts of the empire over the course of about a century and a half, a focus on its major oil companies like BP and the Anglo-Dutch conglomerate Shell. In Karl's book, Fueling Empire, which I have here with me, um, the focus is almost entirely on Britain and its empire and British oil companies, both large and small. The book points out that the British Empire had the world's second largest oil industry after the U.S., and that as such, it merits separate consideration from the U.S. The key difference between the U.S. and Great Britain and their oil industries in those days is that, of course, Britain did not have a domestic oil industry, at least not at that time. And therefore, in making a shift from reliance mainly on coal to reliance on oil in the early 20th century, the empire had to rely on overseas supplies pretty much exclusively, which came almost entirely from the empire. As such, the book has a lot to commend it from the standpoint of British studies. A focus on the British element of the world stories draws out certain things that a multinational story might not. Key among them, the intensity of the country's dependency on overseas networks. And then moving beyond that general insight, the book offers many ideas for understanding British and imperial history more broadly. Fueling Empire opens with a chapter that delineates the close relationship between the imperial government, local colonial officials, and the managers of oil companies. And we're reminded of well-known stories about British oil interests in Iran and Iraq, and they're put in the context of some stories that are less well known, at least to me. So I did not know very much about the history of the Trinidad oil industry that Karl talks about in the book, and also the Burmese oil industry, which was quite significant. The book does well to highlight the instability of British rule in these countries as nationalist movements came to the fore in the years before and after the Second World War. And so, as the book unfolds over the course of six very tightly written, six very well documented chapters, the readers, see different ways in which the British government and British oil companies managed the instability of these networks of people and technology and geographical challenges. The book paints a complex picture that goes well beyond the older stories about the top-down imposition of imperialist technologies. And for example, British managers and scientists, we see that they did live in segregated bases all around the oil-producing parts of the empire. It's a story that kind of reminded me of the hill stations in India or of colonies of white settlement in other parts of the empire. But in Karl's book, we find out that the oil companies hired and trained technical staffers who were drawn not only from Oxford and Cambridge, but had backgrounds in other universities in Great Britain and ultimately in some universities in the colonies. and that many colonial subjects in various places are trained with technical skills by the oil companies themselves. And so this is not a story that's exclusively about, sort of the top-down role of scientists and technologists and managers and experts, but rather there's a very broad consideration given in the book to expertise at all levels of societies throughout all different cultures and classes. Um, there's a story about unruly um, labor forces that's told in this book, um, especially skilled workers in the oil fields who are colonial subjects. And as nationalist movements unfold, at all times they had the potential to slow down production and even shut it down. And there are some other historians who've written about histories of oil industries that tend to emphasize the stability of um, the workers on the oil fields and how they were sort of more easily manipulated and easily managed than the coal miners back home in Britain. And this book brings out evidence of the unruliness of labor forces in the oil fields overseas as well. Um, we learn, for example, that the oil companies had to hire ex-police officers and ex-army officers to engage in surveillance and security work on the oil fields, for example, which is a story that I've never seen told in the other histories that I've read. And even those efforts on the part of the oil companies to suppress labor unrest were still did not manage to fend off a number of strikes and a number of violent outbreaks that happened, especially in the years between the world wars. Managing the workers and the oil that they produced required extensive networks of technologies. And the book, we see that ships and aircraft and railways all supported the oil industry, along with pipelines and harbors and tank farms. Industry communication is ensured first through telegraph lines and later through telephone lines, both above the ground and under the water. And then there's a nice environmental angle in this book too. The substance of oil itself is unruly, and even advances in various oil field technologies could not stop the oil spills and the explosions that killed and injured many workers. And um, um, there are a lot of colonial subjects who just live close to these oil fields who are affected by some of these disasters that unfold. Um, we also learn that in order to support people out in these dangerous environments, the oil companies sent from home, they sent expatriate workers all kinds of supplies, ranging from medical supplies to tinned food. And in one of my favorite little details in the book, copious quantities of alcohol were sent from Great Britain to the workers, British workers out in the oil fields. Um, in one instance, monthly allowances exceeded like gallons of alcohol. It was really a really impressive little detail there. Overall, the book gives the impression of an imperial network that is trying very hard to sustain itself in ways that were no longer really supportable by the late 1940s and early 1950s. The successor states in these oil regions are shown to suffer from the so-called curse of oil that we have read about in other accounts of the oil industry. That's the tendency of oil-producing nations to lean toward authoritarian and unrepresentative forms of government. That legacy, as well as the legacies of infrastructures and of climate change, are touched upon a little bit in the books. conclusion. So the book paints a convincing picture of a strong network built to overcome and which is eventually overcome by unruly materials and unruly ideologies. As such, the book validates the importance of a British and an imperial perspective on the history of the oil industry. So I think it's especially appropriate to discuss in today's setting. For me, the book did um, raise a couple of questions, and then I'd like to pose to Carl now, just as a way of opening up our conversation. Um, we all know that the development of North Sea oil is largely a post-colonial problem. Post-colonial, I guess, depending on who you might be talking to in Scotland. And I would say, I would ask, to what extent did the practices of the British Imperial Oil Complex extend later on into the North Sea? So that's one thing I was wondering about. And then there's a second question I have for you. As you described, Carl, the book was written at your home university, University of Houston, which has a big U.S.-based contingent of researchers in the history of oil and the history of infrastructure. Um, and I'm wondering what lessons do you think are available from your study for our colleagues who work in the history of the U.S. oil industry? So North Sea and then U.S.
Oh, thanks, William. So let me start with the North Sea, which is a relatively straightforward answer. The difference between the North Sea and everything else the British ever did is that how deep it is offshore. It's almost an entirely different sort of production technology and approach. The state's very sort of the oil industries. And I like you asked this question because I'm working on an article on offshore oil now. There is an imperial component. The British essentially give up defending the law of the sea so they can incorporate more oil offshore in the empire and offshore in the North Sea. And in some ways, the desire for maximizing oil plays into their willingness to go ahead and try to um, really to undertake a very dangerous and environmentally risky oil project at a time of somewhat fiscal and political crisis. So there is some continuity, and also the British government still doesn't know anything about oil and is letting the oil companies run everything in the 1970s and 80s like they did in the empire. The second question is, there is a whole strand of oil history that's triumphalist, and it basically how great the oil industry is and how successful they've been, but they rarely raise the cost. Now, there have been a lot of people writing about the environmental. I mean, Brian Black's piece on Petrolia is very good. There has been a sort of countercurrent, but too much of it is sort of just assumed that the oil companies' account of the development of oil can be trusted, and that the oil companies are open with how they sort of tell their narrative. The one counter to that is you can't actually get at most of their sensitive documents. So there are big holes in this project because, for example, Chevron won't let you look at their archives. BP shuts down large parts of its archives for politically sensitive reasons. The British National Archives are very reticent to give you anything recent. And so I think being more critical of the sources, but also of the sort of way the oil industry tries to shape its narrative would be useful. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Yeah. William, did you have any other questions, or should we open it up to the audience for Q&A? Or I don't want to take away your time as that.
No, I think it's a great idea to turn it over to the audience now, if that's what you want to do.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, as I said before, if you want, you can drop your question in the chat at any point. I can read it out for everyone. Or if you'd like to raise your Zoom hand, we can go ahead and do it that way as well. And if we, Jeffrey, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Happy to get us started. Karl, your book sounds absolutely fascinating. I will confess that some years back I had jotted down in my own notebook of ideas of potential future projects, Britain and oil. But so I really appreciate you taking that off the table for me, because I thought it was a great idea, but a book that I would be woefully unqualified to write. I do have one particular question for you. So I've been researching Britain's withdrawal from Palestine in 1947. And there are lots of references in that decision-making process about needing to sort of preserve, secure British access to oil. I think that's pretty well known. My question for you is, how important was oil in British foreign policy making, I would say, writ large, right? As part of a number of factors that governments take into consideration. And I guess maybe a sort of second part of that would be, other than 1947, which I just referred to, what would be a couple of key moments when you think the British government was particularly focused on oil as a sort of leading factor in their foreign policy decision making? Thanks.
That it's a really interesting question because it's sort of a two-sided question. I would argue that oil policy is sort of after the First World War, which is sort of a critical moment for the British when they realize how dependent they are for oil on the Americans, and where they realize they don't have enough oil, bumps oil up to the top of the table as an important issue, and they build a whole oil policy that becomes sort of a template for the entire interwar period and even after the war. So there's sort of an assumption that oil is significant. And there are steps taken in oil states to ensure the flow of oil and to continue to contest for resources with the United States and other countries. So in some sense, it's sort of an undercurrent of a larger strategic reorientation. If you want to think about the warfare state, for example, that people have talked about, it's a built-in component of it. So in some ways, it's never at the top of the table in the same way. There are moments of crisis, for example, 1937 to 39, when there's a massive wave of strikes in the global oil industry, but particularly in Burma, Trinidad, and in Mexico, and it affects the British government's ability to access oil. It becomes a critical issue and raises to the top. It's also the case in the 1950s when the Iranian oil crisis begins around nationalization. It becomes the single most important issue. But again, it's part of a larger strategic orientation that begins to decay after 45. And so this desire for oil in many ways becomes almost counterproductive in the relationship with the United States after 1945. I don't know if that answers it, but I think that's where I would go. It's never the top, but it's always there.
Great, thanks so much. Dane, you want to go ahead next?
Sure. Hi. I don't know. Can you hear me? It says my internet's unstable. Okay. First of all, let me apologize. I joined late, and whatever comments I have, and I have comments, not questions, may have already been addressed. But let me first of all just say that I've read Karl's book. It's absolutely terrific, and it's really important. And it's important not just because it extends our understanding of this imperial oil regime beyond the Middle East, which is where much of the attention has been placed, to the Caribbean and elsewhere, but also because of the focus it gives to the issue of labor And it strikes me that there's something interesting going on when we think about Karl's book in the context of three of the previous books that we have had discussions about in this NACBS book series, the ones that have focused mainly upon indentured labor. But we're talking about a continuum of a imperial capitalist labor regime that is reshaped in various ways. And it seems to me, given the fact that four books now over the course of the last few months or year on this subject, that we have something interesting going on historiographically. I think there are many people who probably have wondered, what's the next thing after the new imperial history? Well, it seems to me that maybe the next thing, the new thing, is imperial capitalism and the labor regimes that it creates. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't know if Karl has any thoughts on it or if Bill does, but to my mind, this is really an interesting development, quite apart from the fact that Karl's book is just terrific in its own right. Thanks.
William, did you want to jump in or?
No, go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, since I did labor history for my first book, it was very strange to circle back around. But the context in which we're doing labor history is so radically different than the work that was done in the 70s and 80s, which was very much focused on the West and in terms of labor process and very much a sort of inward-looking discussion of labor. The rise of studies of racial capitalism and of the global division of labor really critically situates where oil field labor lands, because it is an example of the ways in which a racialized labor hierarchy is created by imperial and transnational capital all over the globe.
Yeah.
And those same institutions are building transit points and transportation systems so that resources can be extracted using this labor. It is a commodity frontier in which racial capitalism is at the core of it. And so writing it in the 21st century produces a very different type of project, a very different outcome, and made me look for very different things when I started going through the archival materials and reading the literature. And so that way, I think labor is absolutely at the core of it. And it's been talked about, but never really examined enough. And this is just the beginning. I would say I sort of scratched the surface on a lot of topics, and I think people would easily go past what I've said and do a much deeper dive.
Yeah, I would just add to that another trend in some of the imperial history that we've seen in the last decade or two is a bit more focus on the use of security forces to suppress unrest in colonial situations that went well beyond the sort of norms and constitutional guarantees that are in place in Britain. We've seen case studies just in the last few decades about Ireland, about Palestine, about Kenya. That this is an element of the British Empire story that is drawn out really nicely in Karl's book, as we see imperial officials and the owners and managers of oil companies try to deal with the basic fact that they have to rely on local people and skilled people to get the oil out of the ground, but these people are increasingly susceptible to not only desires for greater wages and greater compensation for their skills, but they're also susceptible to nationalist ideologies and are willing to push back and fight for what they perceive to be their rights.
Thanks. Andrew, do you want to go ahead with the next question?
Yeah. Hi, Karl. Thanks for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It sounds really great.
It's on sale.
Oh,
sorry. It's on sale. I'm joking.
So I have a question, I suppose, about how the book, and William touched on this a little bit with his comments about Jürgen, like how the book sort of connects to those big historiographical narratives that we have about oil and energy, right? So you know, a lot that people will be familiar with is obviously the kind of Timothy Mitchell coal to oil story about democracy and controlling labor and so on. But then also there's, you know, the more recent work in energy histories about challenging the idea of transition, right? And there's no such thing as energy transitions. There's only additions and entanglements between coal and oil and wood or whatever it might be. And so I suppose I'm interested to know if your book sort of connects with, you know, that how does it connect to those big sort of arching historiographical narratives, whether it's the older ones like Mitchell or some of the more recent ones?
It's you know, to think of an older one. I mean, Tim's book came out in 2014, but so I'll talk about that in 2 ways. So the Mitchell thesis, which is, I mean, the book is great because it sort of revived the study of energy history, of oil history, and produced enormous numbers of studies. His students and people inspired by him have done a lot of great work, and the book itself is it's provocative and useful. But I think he got the labor story wrong. English coal miners aren't militant revolutionaries. And the British government could have done a number of things to deal with it, but chose not to. And so I would argue, and then the counter argument or the sort of accompanying argument that oil workers are basically quiet and never revolt, that's also not true. They are constantly, there's a sort of low intensity conflict on the oil field that bubbles up into full scale conflicts regularly. And you can't have a strike in the oil fields in the British Empire without people being killed and hundreds, if not thousands, of people being arrested and detained. So it's a really raw point of intersection between the colonial system and the workers. The second part, I would agree entirely that it's not about a transition story. One of the arguments I make is that coal was still the central fuel for the British Empire until after the Second World War. And even in the 1970s, you can bring down the British government with a coal strike. And this isn't solved until North Sea oil and the big coal miner strike in '84. So I don't think coal goes away, and I don't think the centrality of coal miners go away. And so I try to tell the transition from coal to oil in a somewhat different way as a strategic story that ends up creating a policy focused on guaranteeing British oil. And that's a momentous decision, and probably one that has a lot of consequences down the road for other societies. The British could have just purchased all the oil they wanted, stored it, and built tankers. But instead, they go an imperial route to control oil directly. And so I would argue that it's not that they transition to oil, it's that they see oil as significant and try to acquire as much as they can under British control. And so the transition story is correct. They never stop using coal, and oil is something that adds on until very late in the story I tell, really at the end of my story.
All right, thanks, Andrew. And Daniela, did you have a question?
Hi. Okay, so Karl, you won't be surprised to know that I confess the only chapter of your book that I've read is chapter 2, the one about was it like oil science or whatever, and like technical. And it struck me, of course, that this book is really like part of another wave of the sort of reconceptualization of geology as an imperial science, which we've seen an explosion of work in the last decade as well. But I guess the reason I found this chapter, like, you know, in my own work on Antarctica, in the 50s, BP, you know, sent people to Antarctica on sort of seismic sounding campaigns to, you know, try and find, like, it would be like great to try and find, you know, a source of oil that doesn't have indigenous people. I wonder if you could maybe comment a little bit on the way that in this period, I mean, I guess your book's kind of intersecting with, you know, John Agar's former student, Xiao Yu Luo, who wrote a dissertation a couple of years ago on the British Geological Survey, but like how the search for oil and the trying to like improve extraction methods actually contributed to a large degree to the way that like we conceptualize the structure of the earth. So like how the oil industry is actually feeding like imperial science as well. And I wondered if you could maybe comment a little bit on that, because there is this in this period, even though we're doing all this extraction, an idea of like technocratic. It's okay because science justifies our imperial rule or whatever. How that kind of technocratic rule is tied to these like very traditional extractive industries. And I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit about that.
Well, it took me 40 pages to talk about it, and I don't think I got it completely right. So what I would say is it does justify this technocratic ability justifies British basic possession of resources or dispossessing indigenous people of resources through their superior knowledge of oil and the superior knowledge of production and extraction. It's a colonial science, and there's been a number of interesting pieces done about how that functions as a legitimating force. And even the stories that geologists tell of how much they suffer while they look for oil sort of legitimates it. This isn't just us going in and finding it. We're really making a big effort. And the interesting thing is that British geology has this long history of amateur disdain for extractive industries or for business. And there's a real war between the sort of practical geologists who work in extractive industries in gold mines or in coal mines, and the people who become petroleum geologists, and those who see themselves only as discovering the deep structures of the world. Some of that, which is really interesting, been talked about, is also a racialized notion of geology, that environments reflect fundamental forces that shape racial groups and cultures, and that primitive groups close to nature sort of retain these characteristics. The other thing, I guess one more thing I would say as a final thing, the one place where petroleum geology really contributes to the larger history of geology is in the use of microfossils in order to date strata. And one of the things that happens is they produce enormous amounts of data and they just deposit it, and they're not really interested beyond dating strata. But other geologists begin to look at the microfossil data and realize that it supports the idea of tectonic, of continental drift, because of the way these microfossils are located in multiple places in the same strata. And that becomes, in fact, a critical theoretical component based on this evidence that they had no interest in it. They had none at all. They were sending it off to universities to be storehoused. But once they made a diagnosis of where the oil was, they didn't care. So it's sort of a weird technocratic, non-technocratic approach to knowledge. They're really pragmatic about what they're doing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you have like that specific thing with microfossils and strata and continental drift? Do you have any references you can give me on that? Because I'm doing page proofs, right? Or not page proofs, revisions on a article on continental drift in the British Empire. So
I will send you those offline since I do have your email.
Yes, you do.
Okay,
and just as a brief follow-up, I had the reference that I'd always used for British oil and empire, like as my sort of go-to, of course, was the James Bamberg, right? Where do you see yourself, responding? How do you see yourself responding to that?
You mean to Bamberg's work or to
the what 3-volume million?
Yeah, I have it sitting. Yeah. So Bamberg is a really good scholar, and I mean incredibly hardworking. And I can't believe how much he looked at in the BP archives. But even he was unhappy with what he was doing because BP imposes a lot of limits on how you're allowed to write about them in the official history. And that's one of the limitations of the oil literature in Great Britain, is that much of it is these corporate histories that are produced for the corporations. And so they're very muted about anything other than the sort of corporate story of success. I think Bamberg sort of fell into that and really struggled with that. I think he was unhappy in the end. And they never did a subsequent volume. It's also the case of BP after he finished won't let you look at anything after 1955. So all the stuff he looked at to write his later chapters, we're not allowed to see. So I think I write a different kind of history. He's writing a company history that's incredibly comprehensive and, really the benchmark for understanding the inner workings of the company. That's a different kind of history. I want to write something that talks about how oil gets produced from the ground up rather than the top down.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Danielle. I would like to ask a question before we open it up for others. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the geographies, like what led you to focus on these locations. And so I understand, obviously, the part of this, right, is extending this to show the sort of global nature of this and extending it beyond the Middle East. Which is very well taken and ambitious, but given my own knowledge, right, is very limited to the Middle East. I'm wondering like what in the process led you to focus in on the places that you did choose to focus, Trinidad, for example, and why those particular spots?
That's a really good question. The book starts in 1886 because that's the first British oil field. When the British conquer Upper Burma, they convert the indigenous oil production over to British machine production using mechanical drilling. And so I'm actually looking at places where British companies produce oil. So you're looking in this period, you're looking at Burma and then Russia and then Mexico. Trinidad and Iran start producing commercial oil in the same year in 1908. And so part of what I was doing is trying, where is oil being produced? And it turns out there's a 20-year history of oil production in the British Empire and its sort of dependencies before we start talking about the Middle East. And so I wanted to try to take these, and they're not as large a producers, but I wanted to take them and put them into the larger context and lay Trinidad and Borneo, Iraq, Iran, Mexico next to each other and talk about what are the commonalities and differences in these. So the geography in some ways is driven by where the British find oil. And more importantly, I want to talk about places where the British have control. In other words, it's difficult to talk about the United States where they produce a lot of oil. And in Russia, they sort of get thrown out. In Mexico, it's somewhat tenuous. But in the places that they control absolutely, you see patterns emerging in how they structure the political and economic order to facilitate British oil company production. So it's their obsession with British oil that led me to sort of talk about these areas that are under British control that also produce oil.
Thanks for that.
And just as sort of a side point, the people who helped discover the oil in Iran and Iraq are all from the Indian Geological Service, and they worked in Burma. And when they find oil there, they send them all their experts that are over in Burma. So even though Burma is a minor producer, it's a very significant player in developing oil throughout the British imperial system.
Yeah, that was another question I had was in terms of this sort of question of like imperial careering, right? So, I'm thinking of like A.T. Wilson, who like starts right as an official, and then sort of leaves that role, but comes back right as a manager for the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So still very involved, but right in the interests of oil more explicitly, right? And so do you see a lot of this, right? Obviously, with the scientists, you've noted that this is also something that's going throughout this, imperial and this global imperial network. But is this happening also with like the managers and officials and administrators for these places?
Wilson is the prime example of the way in which officials jump on the gravy train after the First World War. It is remarkable the number of people who take sinecures with the British oil industry, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s. Wilson leaves. He's kicked out of Iraq, and he immediately lands a job as the manager of BP's principal refinery complex. He's the general manager in Iran. He gets a 500% salary raise, and he's running basically their part of the industry in the Middle East. He's employing people he had in Iraq to work for him. He's working with people in the Middle East who were formerly his underlings, but who were still in the political service. So he's the main example of this political, basically oil companies buy political influence by offering positions to people at the top level, and also former army officers, former politicians very quickly fill in the medium ranks of the oil companies in order to benefit. And they make a lot more money, and it's much better conditions of service.
Thank you. So we've got a question in the chat that I will read out, which is, how do imperial authorities respond to labor disputes and disruptions in the oil industry in Trinidad and Burma? What determines the balance between repression and conciliation?
That, that's a good question. Well, first of all, British officials, whether private or public, never accept the legitimacy of strikes or protest. So unions are never legal. Strikes are always militarized, in other words, repressed using military power. So in both cases, the British will respond with civilian police and military police to contain and control the strike movement. They'll then use the civilian authorities to systematically suppress free speech and to arrest the leaders. In Trinidad, they arrest them and deport them. In Burma, they simply arrest them and detain them indefinitely under emergency power rules. And so both the military and police authorities and the civilian authorities focus on repression. They don't open any space. However, because there are nationalist movements in Burma and in Trinidad, you end up with these attempts to examine the causes of the strike. And they bring in people to testify, and they try to come to some sort of conciliatory conclusion that will allow them to sort of tie a bow on what was a fairly violent incident in both Trinidad and Burma. And what they end up arguing for is that they need disciplined labor relations and better institutions to sort of overcome the superstitious, ignorant workers who are easily led astray by agitators. And so their go-to thing becomes constructing systems of labor relations and having labor advisors and trying to build sort of infrastructure of unions that the British can control. It's most notable in post-war Trinidad, where they really take over the union movement. But they try to do the same thing in Burma, but it fails because of the intensity of hostility.
Excellent, thank you. Dan, you have a question?
Yes, hi. So in my own work on the rubber industry, also extractive, also in tropical or subtropical imperial spaces, there are a lot of like public health and environmental control efforts around things like tropical disease. Mostly, I mean, not sort of altruistically, but because an ill plantation worker can't work as effectively. I was wondering if in your own research here, you saw any unrelated to the direct environmental control of oil extraction, you saw any of these kind of like tangential efforts at environmental control or public health initiatives in sort of a similar fashion in these spaces.
Yes, it's sort of it works in two ways. One, oil companies are working in places with limited medical infrastructure, so they build a whole network of medical treatment facilities, emergency clinics, hospitals, and so there's a medical infrastructure created by Western doctors who treat this explicitly as, particularly when we talk about disease, as a tropical disease environment. And malaria is the critical one. Because of its impact, particularly in Trinidad and Iran. About 30 or 40% of the Iranian workers come down with malaria in any 1 year. And it's also a threat to Westerners. And so they build this whole infrastructure of medical intervention, and they conceptualize it as this sort of exotic tropical environment. But it's also racially segregated so that European doctors treat Europeans, and indigenous doctors, Burmese or Iranian doctors, will treat their local populations. So even in the midst of building this sort of medical scientific hierarchy, they undergird it with race and class as critical differences in medical care. Up until 1928, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company runs the quarantine system in southern Iran because there are repeated episodes of plague and cholera in the 19 teens and 20s that they're trying to deal with. But when the British are forced to give up their conventions that control those parts of Iran, that reverts to the Iranian government. And the British are irritated, and the doctors lose their salaries and complain about it bitterly. But it's exactly like they want to create a healthy environment, but only because it impinges upon productivity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so do we have any other questions? Phil, go ahead.
There he is.
Hey, Phil.
Hey, Karl, how are you doing, my friend? Great to see you. I should start by apologizing. Like I've got your book on my desk. It's been a standing rebuke for me for months now, and I was going to read it last week, but then a job search and an administrative crisis got in the way. So my bad. But I'm even more pumped to read it now based on the conversation today, and I look forward to a much more extensive conversation and a much better educated conversation down the road. But I was very intrigued by a lot of the remarks, but especially what Dane had to say about the relatively new attention now being paid to imperial capitalism and labor regimes. And one thing I encourage my students to think about is perceptual differences between here in Britain and out there and in the empire. And I wonder if that might be a way to help me understand how oil works by, if you want to, I just want to invite you to riff on similarities and differences between oil production over the period you cover and coal production within Britain itself over that same period. Because one thing that really kind of strikes me is that you've really focused upon the repressive nature of the colonial state vis-a-vis oil workers. But within about 10 years of your start date, collective bargaining is sort of legally established as a legitimate thing in Britain itself. And so I was just hoping that, given your knowledge, you might be able to riff a little bit on here versus out there with respect to labor relations in two profoundly extractive, energy-related industries.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people who studied coal geology, shift over to petroleum, including John Cadman, who's like one of the central figures in the industry because he runs BP for 20 years and also runs the Iraq Petroleum Company. What's interesting is that the British side, you have the construction of collective bargaining, you have health and safety inspections, you have a variety of state controls over the process, even though coal is in many ways more dangerous than oil, although we don't really know because they don't do a lot of statistics. So there is this whole infrastructure built on what Bill was talking about in terms of the assumptions of civil rights and liberties that Europeans possess. In the empire, first of all, none of these institutions exist. There are no labor bureaus. There are no health and safety groups. In other words, the state doesn't exist as a regulatory system in this industry at all. And it's not till 30 or 40 years into the industry that you begin to see the emergence of labor bureaus and health bureaus to study these things. And so that makes it very hard. It's sort of opaque. What happened, what is health and safety and work like when you don't really have any institutions calling attention to it? So it's sort of, it's a little choppy. I can recreate some data. So what happens in the empire, you could argue, is sort of like what happened in Britain before the unions grew up and before collective bargaining. The companies run the systems. They examine your health. They determine what safety is. They're the ones who award compensation. They're the ones who are in control of the whole process. And so the lack of rights and the sort of inability to dissent from the findings of the state or the oil company really pisses people off. It's a big grievance in the 1930 strikes that their compensation is virtually nothing, and they can't even complain because they have no cash or no access to the legal system. So in some ways, the oil industry exists in this sort of perfect world where they control all the systems, and the state never interferes in most of their important decision making. And that's kind of the story of the oil industry in Texas, even today. The amount of government regulation is really quite light. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I have offhand.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you for that.
Well, also stating you're talking about your interest. The other thing about the labor story is migration. Massive migration streams linked to oil industry workforces. And so all of these things tie into larger trends that you talk about in your book and continue in some ways accelerate in the 20th century.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any final questions? If not, we are coming up against time, but if there's anyone that's got a desperate final question. All right. Well, if not, then
I'll sneak one more in.
oh,
Sneak more
please
in if nobody else
go ahead,
offer.
Phil,
And
please.
I was interested in this, and that is, Karl, what do you consider like your biggest challenges in the making of this book that you successfully overcame?
Well, you know, making it not a 400-page book. You know, I cut 25% or a third of the manuscript, 25% of the manuscript. The sort of tension between the enormous volume of sort of oil industry literature and theoretical literature that I had to read, but to balance that against finding archival sources that allowed me to think about what these sort of larger theoretical works were saying. And it sort of, I'd spend months in the archives. And then I'd come back and I'd have to read 20 books. And then you go, well, I didn't get the right stuff out of the archive. So there was a bit of, I always felt like I was being leapfrogged. And I finally, during the pandemic, I read everything I had in terms of data. And so I could write. But it was a struggle. I hadn't realized just how much material I was going to find. I was really overconfident in my ability to know this. I mean, I never studied the Middle East, Trinidad, or Burma in any sustained way. And all of a sudden, I have to read the literature on this and not be an idiot when I try to create these little capsule political sketches. So it was a somewhat challenging project, and I still feel that there are places I missed, and so, but I'm not going to write another one. So.
No part two to look forward to. All right.
Well,
Then
maybe. We'll see.
All right, then I hope everyone will join me in thanking Karl and William today. This was a great discussion, and we will wrap it up for today. And if everyone check back on our website for future events, and hope to see you at a couple of them later on. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Dawn.